Look west from a window in the upper floors of New York's One World Trade Center, and you might notice a gigantic mural facing the Manhattan skyline. Imperiously emerging from a black background, 23 stories tall, and painted in the style of an 18th century botanical illustration, is a graffito of a weed, Eutrochium purpureum. Caron began painting weeds in public spaces around 2006, initially for a stop-motion animation project, but she soon realized the enormous potential of her chosen subject and decided to go big. Caron has developed a worldwide urban macroherbarium visible in cities such as New York and San Francisco in the States, Porto Alegre in Brazil, Quito in Ecuador, Vigo in Spain, and Mumbai in India. She sees painting weeds as a form of resistance. Her phytograffiti, as she calls them, are accessible landmarks of social and ecological resilience. Eutrochium purpureum is commonly known as Joe Pye weed. The plant's name is a homage to the Mohican healer who utilized it in indigenous phytotherapy. The roots of Caron's mural reach deep into the fraught histories of cultural subjugation and forced eradication upon which the foundations of the United States were laid. It proudly stands as a prayer for cultural healing, its bold visibility at once a vivid reminder of the erasure of indigenous cultures and a celebration of their intimate relationship with the vegetal world. Positioned at the heart of the urban fabric, Caron's murals mark sites of interconnectedness among peoples, geographies, and resources, or the lack of thereof. By nature, cities are sites of unstable and unjust topographies, endlessly disrupted by all kinds of powers and forces. Urban evolutions, with their displacements and erasures, are intrinsically defined by the opposition of capitalism and social forces, the center and the periphery, financial districts and forsaken neighborhoods. Fertile ground is rare, but weeds thrive on very little. They are emblems of tenacity and catalysts of hope, monuments of strength and markers of diversity. Sometimes weeds in contemporary art are rooted in the past. Their stems emerge from present-time interactions with local people and specific places. Their blooms remind us that the power of dissidence is a natural element that ecosystems need in order to thrive. Over the past 10 years, weeds have become a distinct genre in art, and artists harness the disruptive power embodied by weed being across a broad range of media. Weeds are symbolically charged like no other category of plants. Art magnifies and politicizes the very definition of weed, leading to important and nuanced discourses that encompass biology, ecology, geography, and politics. The often quoted statement, "A weed is a plant out of place," from The Killer Inside Me, a 1952 novel written by Jim Thompson, now seems a simplistic and somewhat reductive definition of the biopolitical and ecocultural registers that weeds can encompass and evidence through artistic expression. Unwanted plants from a fecund polysemic category. Their agential power is enhanced by our cultural dependency on hierarchy and order, an inherent reliance on binary structures that still defines our thinking today. Weeds are not just plants out of place anymore. This bespeaks an outdated sense of passivity. More accurately, contemporary artists show us that weeds actively weaken the foundations of order and perceived conceptions of purity. They thrive in the shadow of power. For most weeds, there isn't a proper place to exist, and their total eradication is what most people desire. Some species are indigenous, while others have been imported and cultivated. Many were unintentionally displaced. A vast number were brought to a place that initially seemed right, but quickly turned out wrong. Right and wrong. This false dichotomy no longer adequately contains the complex issues raised by weeds in art, intricacies that species by species and artist by artist only become more and more entangled. It is in this context that contemporary artists keep returning to the places where weeds grow in search of naturalized manifestations of resilience capable of foregrounding diversity, alterity, and historical roots, while challenging our pre-established notions of what is considered normal by a capitalist-grounded majority. In the eyes of contemporary artists, what does it mean to resist like a weed? Chicago-based photographer Jin Lee has assembled a photographic herbarium cataloging weeds that grow in back alleys. These are the non-human urban dwellers that thrive on rainwater alone while occasionally getting pissed on by dogs. Gently referencing Albrecht Dürer's famous watercolor Great Piece of Turf from 1503, the plants in Lee's series aren't necessarily out of place. Chicago alleys are full of weeds that people more or less tolerate and urban pollinators adore. But it is how the plants relate to the broader urban context, the history and topography of the city, that charges their political potential. The ones that Lee photographed with such care are proletarian weeds. They bear no cultural importance and are invisible, always multiple and disposable. In the context of the local phytoranking of Chicago, these plants are the antithesis of the lush cultivars that grace the magnificent mile in the heart of town, where alleys are rare and unaffordable luxury apartments are the norm. Dispossessed in a city known for its policies of racial and social segregation, Lee's weeds resist adversity and resourcefully adapt. They survive, determined. Some are native to the Chicago region, whereas others have come from afar. They thrive together, side by side. The angle, the light, the focus. Lee's lens evidences their dignity. They have earned every bit of their being for themselves. As a concept, weeds emerge from a settler colonial logic of ordering, with its related taxonomies and ontologies that reinforce boundaries between inside and outside, center and periphery. They grow against anthropocentric relativist constructs grounded in fierce exclusionism. There are certain kinds of social and cultural normativity that weeds irreparably perturb, simply with their presence. Once again, the upset they cause is not generated by the presumed rightness or wrongness of their placement. It's most likely their determined unpredictability, their unwillingness to stay put, conform, and comply that troubles the system. There's a powerful incontainability to weeds that is profoundly unsettling. They often instill fear of contamination and corruption. Once they take hold, it's impossible to get rid of them. These notions are explored by Canadian artist Zachary Logan through his meticulously crafted pastels on paper. A recurring motif in his work is the ditch, a weed-infested liminal space, an unglamorous periphery of institutionally neglected land, a gutter with no purpose other than to serve as a drain or dump. The ditch, often undisturbed, is where weeds can thrive and reclaim territory, away from the center, far from sight. In Logan's work, the ditch is neither a right nor a wrong place, but the site of the unwanted, the marginalized, the overlooked cultural fringe to which the LGBTQ+ community has been historically relegated. But Logan's ditch is also a site of attraction and desire, a provider of nectar and pollen for insects, and a sheltered site for encounters. There's sheer beauty of an unconventional kind in Logan's vision. Far from the tidy splendor of well tended plants and the normalized banality of formal gardens, tendrils, leaves, petals, and stems foreground the essence and the importance of diversity across culture as well as ecology. The power weeds have to resist normativity also runs deep in the work of Zhang Bo, who for years now has produced large scale interventions aimed at rewilding institutions and commercial spaces. In 2013, for the West Bund Architecture and Contemporary Art Biennale, Zhang transformed a disused cement factory that had been reclaimed by the local flora into a found temporary botanical garden of weeds. Plants living in Shanghai from 2013 also involved the participation of local scholars and an online open access course exploring the history of Shanghai through its plants, capitalized on the implicit invitation of weeds to follow them into rewilded futures. In Weed Party, a project that began in 2015, Zhang further explored his inquiry into the agency of unwanted plants as both literal and metaphorical disruptors akin to political movements that spread cultures of resistance against totalitarian powers. The creation of a temporary garden filled with horseweed, Erigeron canadensis, an invasive species native to North America and now common throughout eastern China, raised important questions about our perceptions of plants in relation to their origins. What is at stake in the proliferation of this weed? National identity? The past of a nation? Or the future of ecosystems? Which parameter most strongly influences one's response to weeds' persistence? Which should we prioritize in our decision making when weeds are involved, and why? Questions about national identity, history, and ecologies, as well as diasporic experience and the racialization of nature, are further explored in the work of Nigerian-American artist Precious Okoyomon. Her installation To See the Earth Before the End of the World filled the unforgettable Last Gallery of the Milk of Dreams, the main exhibition at the 59th Venice Biennale. In the space, kudzu and sugarcane were allowed to grow unchecked throughout the run of the event, eventually nearly smothering the monolithic figures made of soil and straw that dotted the space. Ancestral guardians, pantheistic deities, or future human non-human incarnations, their stern postures and enigmatic silence cast them as witnesses to a future renaissance in which humans are no longer the center of all things. Okoyomon's installation was overwhelmingly sensual, brimming with livingness, the humidity, the fragrance of the earth, the smell of the leaves. Post-colonial essence permeated the exhibit. Kudzu and sugarcane share different and yet indissolubly related histories of displacement, domestication, and ecological devastation. Kudzu was brought to the United States from its native Japan in 1876 for the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Many decades later, in the 1930s, the US government used it to mitigate the severe soil erosion caused by the inconsiderate intensive cultivation of cotton on slave plantations across the American South. Both kudzu and sugarcane share histories in which ecology, economy, racialization, and exploitation are deeply rooted. The disastrous biological and cultural histories entangled in the roots of these two plants, both native to Asia, became indissolubly intertwined into American soil, each in turn at different times. Each is a weed or a desirable commodity, depending on the cultural milieu. The ecological damage caused by these plants and their mismanaged dissemination by humans across enormous swaths of land is directly connected to the history of slavery, another process of forced and mass relocation of lives that were and still are deemed unworthy and undesirable by many. Okoyomon's vision of the future is one that cannot forget the past, one in which the definition of invasive plant species is problematized to the point that it entirely loses its meaning. The racialization of the natural world, the narratives of social resistance and freedom, the embodiment of reparative practices, and the invitation to care. Weeds as monuments of resilience are constantly quivering, agitated by relentless winds of change. They invite us to craft new registers of resistance modeled on ecological practices of tenacity and dissidence, grounded in a past of injustice that still haunts the present. Weeds in contemporary art monumentalize the raw and relentless beauty of resilience. Whether biological entities grounded in living ecosystems or well-crafted metaphors, or both at once, these weeds complicate our conceptions of self, harnessing anthropomorphic strategies that invite us to think about our actions and political orientations, but never reduce plants to hollow vessels of narcissistic symbolism. The work of contemporary artists shows that the unsettling agency of weeds today mostly lies in their independence and autonomy, which is the biggest threat they can pose to the system. They survive and thrive despite the deliberate neglect by institutions and governments, as well as law enforcement's unwarranted repression. They emerge over and over, and therefore never go extinct. What they represent is indelible, forever self-perpetuating, and blooming.